Welcome, Ziyaad.
Hello, how are you?
Happy. I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. I really liked our meeting prior to this one, just to kind of talk about what are the most important and salient points from the work that you guys are doing that would be interesting to the Tethics and Chill community. So let's start with just Nabiha, your journey to Mozilla, your personal mission, which I'm assuming drives your professional mission, and kind of what led you to take on this position at this particular inflection point in your career and probably an inflection point in Mozilla's brand.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I am a super fangirl of Ex Ante, of the entire human agency community, and it just feels like really special to be a part of this. And I felt that at the outset, but especially December 2025, with everything that has happened in the last year, like feels really good to be in the right community that is willing to tackle all the messy questions that technology presents to us. It's cool to be here. Thank you.
Is December really messy this month?
It's like this whole year. This December is like the month in which I'm reflecting on the messiness
Yeah.
of 2025. And I'm like, oh wow, what's happening? But in
Yeah.
terms of, you're right that like the personal journey is the animator for the professional journey. And I think for me, I think it's Richard Feinberg always, or Feynman had the like, for every person, there are 12 questions that guide their inquiry. And for me, the top question that's like guided so much of what I do is actually very simple. It's what are the rules that shape what is possible? Like just what is the architecture that helps you decide like this is possible, this is impossible. And I think it was really rooted in me at a very early age. Like my parents were immigrants to the United States and they were drawn by the sense of possibility here, right? Like America felt like a place where you could do a lot that they couldn't in their home country of Pakistan. And then I went on to law school, which is like literally the rules of what can and cannot be done with jail at its boundaries. And then I focused in First Amendment and media law, and I was really interested in journalism, the boundaries of investigative journalism, because that's how you shape and sense make reality, which is ultimately what shapes what you think is possible. And I became really obsessed with how the internet could disrupt, shape, morph, form your view of what is happening and what is possible at the time. The draw to Mozilla was kind of a slow burn. Early Firefox user because I was terminally online as a child. Early Thunderbird user, actually like using Thunderbird, using PGP email through a Thunderbird client, like gave me my first big break in my career because I was at a law firm and working really late. And a partner opened his door and was like, hi, who knows how to use encrypted email? And I did because I use Thunderbird. And I was like, me, I do. And that's how I ended up a baby associate on the team that was representing the Guardian and the Edward Snowden disclosures. So literally, it was like the Mozilla love affair began early and was sort of in the backdrop. But ultimately, what brought me to the foundation, which is the nonprofit that backs the corporation of Firefox, MZLA, which makes Thunderbird, Mozilla AI, and Mozilla Ventures, was this sense of like, Mozilla is really about how community-led technology through open source creates possibilities in a different way than sort of centralized power and centralized creation. And that's true for Firefox. That's true for like the tens of thousands of people who come together to build Common Voice, which is the world's largest crowdsource voice language database. And so Mozilla was just a place where like you could talk about what was possible in a very different way, going back to that root question. And you could do it in a way that was really different. Like law and journalism are both places where you talk a lot about what's possible. This was a place where we could build. And I really wanted to be in a place where you could build the rules and shape the rules in a more active way, not just understand them sort of passively. So that's why I got here.
The rest of the conversation really needs to be about how you are planning to shape what's possible in technology, but I can't drop this question because you introduced yourself as someone who represented, was it The Guardian during during the Edward Snowden disclosures? Without having to comment on that, does it feel like the Overton window has shifted on what the public is going to get up in arms about since those disclosures so many years ago to what now people are willing to just let slide?
Oh,
Like, I
totally.
think if that happened today, I'm not even making a judgment call on Snowden. It's just if those disclosures happened today, it would be like, okay, well, that's just a Friday news dump.
Yeah. I remember at the time, because also, you know, in representing a news organization, you tend to know things before they're made known to the public. That's part of that relationship. And the feeling was like, oh my God, when the public finds out about this, everyone's going to be up in arms. Everyone is really going to be shocked. And it wasn't everyone, but it was enough of, I think, a public who previously did not really care about privacy, who became aware of the possibilities and sort of the flip side of all of the connectivity that we thought was just unmitigated upside. Like, isn't it amazing to be connected? Like, not necessarily, because there's downsides and there's real risk for that. And I agree with you that I think if something like that came out now, people would be sort of like, oh yeah, well, that's what happens. And so I really think of like that sort of Snowden moment as people really on a much wider level understanding the potential downsides of technology in a way that could be quite personal to them. Um, but I think we're in a different kind of reckoning moment right now, like with the slop conversations. I think it probably isn't the shock of surveillance and privacy, in part because we've heard about it, but people still maintain the ability to be like shocked, angry, upset, and demand better. And I think that's the best backdrop to be building in. I don't know, Ziad, what do you think? You metabolized all of this from a very different place in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I was in South Africa at the time. I am South African. And so to see that kind of appear on the scene, it was just like this global moment of like, okay, something big is happening, but you're not fully experiencing and then participating to the same extent because I was based in South Africa. But I think I agree. I think the context has completely shifted. People have moved to a sense of, I wouldn't say hopelessness, but apathy in many respects around things that ordinarily and in that stage would have been considered huge moments, for sure, for sure. I don't want to necessarily say that if a Snowden type disclosure came out that people would react with that kind of apathy, but there's definitely been more structural measures in place around our use of technology, economic structures, incentives that make it much more difficult to react globally in the same way that we did before. And because there's so many news cycle shocks.
Yeah, there's another term that Nabiha you mentioned that I wanted to double click on to borrow corporate terminology, which is sense making. And I think it's my thesis that the just social media overwhelm has eroded our ability to sense make what's going on around us and to pull apart what's noise from signal and therefore make like judicious judgment calls as a informed citizenry. Comment on that.
I think, well, I'm really curious for Ziad's perspective as
Yeah.
a democracy scholar of like democratic theory. From where I sit, especially coming from my first job at a media organization was at the New York Times. From the vantage point of being in institutional media and then sort of disruptive digital media and now being extremely online, I think sense making happens in micro communities versus through the lens of like institutional media that shapes a narrative and says, this is the narrative. These are the facts that support that narrative. And that approach led to a tremendous amount of stability for a very long time and also exclusion of a lot of alternative views, right? And so something like Snowden could be that kind of unifying, like, shit moment because it actually dominated most of the channels that were entrusted with sense making. What the big difference since then is now this sense making happens in these very small, like they're all tiles of a larger mosaic, but they don't necessarily all add up to any image that's intelligible to us. And so sense making is happening, but not in this sort of centralized way that you can then generate consent and like unification on a plan forward. And so you have all of this noise that's there. I think it still happens. And I think the work is like, and this is one of the things I love about this community. How are we sense making in response to different phenomena that are happening in parallel? That actually, if we found each other, we would have a critical mass of power to really shift things. How do we find one another in those little circles is challenging and is not going to be, we need to unlearn the old ways of doing that because we're going to need to find new ways. It's not going to be hashtags on Twitter, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I almost would say I staked my kind of career claim on the importance of making decisions and judging as cornerstones of human society. It's how we make political decisions, social decisions. It's so important. It's been a bedrock of moral and political thought since ancient history. The importance on making good decisions, developing judgment. And to add to your point, Anastasia, what you were saying about separating signals from noise, it's so important to form those, to have that ability for critical thinking, to form judgments. And what I struggle with right now is overwhelm. There's just so much content, there's so much noise, and there's not probative value that is easily discernible to be able to say, okay, this is how that fits in this larger structure, and this is how I judge according to some preset form of standards that I've developed or honed over through experience. But what we're being presented with is just kind of overwhelm. And what younger
Yeah.
generations are experiencing is overwhelm.
It's wild how the early structures of social media over-indexed on amplifying things that are interesting and novel and maybe loud and therefore extreme, and that became a proxy for what's important. And it, in the beginning, that looked like unmitigated upside. Okay, well, let's just try this and see what happens. And then all of the externalities compounded, but we're socialized to a whole bunch of people that aren't necessarily like a vocal, visible group. And so now we're just like feeling the accumulated crush of a bunch of stuff that's very loud being amplified over stuff that's very important being amplified. And I don't know that there's like an easily replaceable proxy for that we can measure and that keeps people using technologies, which really gets into a lot of the work that I think you guys are trying to do, which is how do you find new opportunities and categories for builders to start paying attention to, even if those aren't ones that investors will like take a risky bet on. What's the thesis behind kind of unlearning prior defaults and finding new opportunities to default towards and nudge founders and technologists towards?
Yeah. So when I came into Mozilla, I decided that I was going to spend 10 hours a day in 20-minute increments talking to as many people who were like in the organization, outside of the organization, alum of the organization, fellows of the organization, people who were donors, just like if you wanted 20 minutes with me for about 3 months, you could have it. And that was like a very aggressive learning journey. But there were a couple of themes that just came out from that. People saying, I love technology, or past tense, I loved my experience on the internet, but it all just kind of feels inevitable. It's done. It's inevitable now. Like the power's consolidated, the capital is behind it. There's nothing we can do. And it was so jarring to hear from people who are so sharp and so capable and have so many skills, this sort of like just resignation, like it's done. And what that fed was like an imagination deficit, right? This like idea of like, why even bother dreaming something else? It's not going to happen. It's not possible. And the only like glimmer of agency people were articulating was the ability to like buy or not buy something, or be like, I guess I could use like Proton Mail instead of Gmail, which is like such a narrow form of imagination, right? And to me, particularly like shockingly anathema to my experience of the internet, where I was like, let me learn how to code so my MySpace page can look amazing, right? Like I experienced the internet as a thing that was interactive and dynamic and so irresistible because it was under my control. And then I could learn. And then that was like sort of the promise of the original web for me. And I just was like, oh my God, like I'm at an institution that really helped forge that mindset for so many. What would it look like to make good on the original promise to do that? What that requires is a moment of stepping back and saying, we've like gathered all of these expectations along the way because we've been shaped into believing that. How do you say this is a breaking point? We're going to unlearn, right? We're going to unlearn to reopen the design space that's possible after this perceived ossification. And how do we look at defaults and say like, no, thanks. Actually, I don't want that.
There's actually so much research on like a binary choice not actually being a sovereign choice, because if the choice is, between signing this, EULA and therefore participating in something that like a service that's just important and germane and unavoidable in like modern society versus not signing the EULA and not using the service, like it's not really a choice. You're sort of forced into it. But on the other hand, okay, so let's give people all the choices. Now you have a bunch of choice spam, and like, it's hard to figure out what's important, and people won't want that either. And so how do you help system designers to shape useful defaults because those limit our perception of what's even possible. So then you need designers who offer options for possibilities that aren't like overwhelming, but also are thoughtfully agentic.
Yeah, and to also realize that actually that space for imagination doesn't only sit with the designers, right? So what I think has been so interesting about our work, and Ziyaad, I'm going to hand it to you to talk about creative futures in a second, is like for so many of the people that I was talking to in that accelerated, very intense listening cycle, they're like, well, I'm just an educator. I'm just a parent. I'm not a technologist. I'm not a designer. I have nothing to say. And that actually to me felt like the space to disrupt is like, how do you get signals from groups of people who actually do have something to say in a way that's legible and digestible for the designers to expand their set of opportunities of what they could be designing around, to also have that early signal of like, there is actually a market for this, right? Like there is actually a category here of things that people need. And so identifying communities of people who could engage in that process of early upstage ideation and then both introduce it into the tech, like the product formation process, as well as a capital allocation, like a non-dilutive capital allocation process is like kind of, that's our magic. And so Ziyaad, I'll let you share a little bit about how we approach that with creatives in Hollywood this year and what we're doing next year and the year after.
Yeah, I mean, zooming out, unlearning is and has been a way in which we unlearn different boundaries across disciplines. I think it's been super important for us to do that. And part of that is creating unexpected links between different communities. What are faith-based communities saying? What is important to them? What are creatives and creators doing in this space? What are the things that are on their minds? And the reason is pretty simple. We treat imagination as a core input. It's infrastructure, right? If we are sitting with those folk who have different perspectives, different forms of imagination, or thinking about the world in different ways, we can start to separate and form that judgment about, signal versus noise, and also start to support the kind of full product pipeline that starts with communities, from unexpected communities through to development, and pushing out and products and platforms downstream as well. So that's what we've been doing. The program that Nabiha is talking about is called Creative Futures. It sits with me at the foundation, where we reached out to artists and creatives here in Hollywood. We asked them what was important to them, but we were fully cognizant of the fact that they're not the right folks to be doing technical product development, right? So we listened to what they said, we recorded it, with everyone's consent and permission, what is most important to you? And then we took those principles and we tapped creative technologists in the Bay Area, and we built a prototyping residency on the back of that, right? And so there was a clear sequencing, and that forms part of our ideational pipeline, which doesn't just stop there, because we have an incubator. We actually ship and build products from the foundation. We've just done that. We have a Mozilla data collector, which is a platform that we just launched this year. The unlearning that we had to do was to say, let's think more broadly with broader groups and communities, and let's also think very upstream at the level of category formation, where we can develop a very discerning set of tastes and judgment about what will become big and where we want to place our bets.
Did you figure out any specific categories that seem to be emerging but aren't quite ready to be like venture backed? I think the idea of like making it safer for technologists and innovators to go try a thing that might not necessarily get venture funding, but is definitely a candidate for non-dilutive grants or something. It's so important, definitely the way I think that philanthropy should be going. But what have you figured out there that is like early signal for people that might be listening to this podcast?
I mean, there are certain areas, for example, the first cohort of our incubator is all focused on the environment, because when we reached out to creatives, educators, faith leaders, one of the first things that people will say is like, well, I don't even want to have the AI conversation if it's going to burn up our planet. And that is a great entry point to talk about, well, okay, that is a very fair critique of a particular mode of AI development, but that's actually not the whole game. So like, let's talk about it, right? And let's talk about what measurement capabilities are available for us to assess what the environmental impacts are. Let's also talk about the full panoply of potential options of what this technology development could look like. So offers both critique, offers both a learning opportunity and a building opportunity. And I would say that was like One of the really core insights in my first few months at Mozilla and the foundation for quite some time had been doing a lot of advocacy, critique, research, like kind of that shape of work, which is exceptional, exceptional work. And it wasn't always positioned in a, okay, we've identified a problem. Every problem is an innovation space. Like every problem is a thing that you can try to fix or say abstain from entirely. Like it doesn't always need to be like solutionist, but it offers an opportunity, and that's the entire way that we're now remaking the foundation, is to really say critiques need to lead to ideation, to prototypes, to things that where we do attribute this sort of philanthropic risk capital, where we get follow-on funding from philanthropy tables that we're a part of, like Humanity AI, which I know we'll get to. And there's a real appetite for that. But Ziyaad, are there other signals that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to the list, and I'll talk about our incubator cohorts and upcoming ones, but data agency, huge one. See,
Who's asking for that?
I mean, Nabiha can talk more about that, but I mean, it's born out of both our work with our creatives, but also like the necessity of our work with Common Voice. So Nabiha, I don't know if you want to add like a couple of sentences on like how we built, shipped, and are working on Mozilla Data Collective and data agency, but I can then add some of the other signals.
Our work with Common Voice and like pulling together these sort of crowdsourced data sets around languages, particularly low resource languages, is based on a really simple insight, which is that there were going to be great data sets for Spanish and for French and for modern standard Arabic and English, but probably not Flemish or Sindhi or Catalan. So let's set up a way for people to actually be able to participate in that data set creation in a decentralized way. What that led to after several years of just really investing in Common Voice is more and more people coming to us from institutions like governments, libraries, art museums, regular museums saying, hey, we actually have really incredible data sets too, but we don't want to just put them online because we don't want them to be hungry hippoed by everyone out there. We don't want them to be scraped without our consent. But these are actually forms of knowledge that are extremely important that we want to be compensated for, but we want to participate in the theoretical joy of the openness of the web. What do we do? And so we kept hearing that signal and we're like, okay. And so Louis Zhang, who looks after Common Voice, was like, listen, we could build our own marketplace for this that has a variety of different licenses that are available for people to choose, different pricing opportunities for people so they don't just take whatever opportunistic price for their data set happens to be presented to them in time zero, and like, let's just build it. And that went from ideation to the deployment of $10 million of capital to spin this up, and in a couple of months spin it out of Mozilla Foundation. Like March, February of this year to spin out in Q1 of next year. And I dropped the link in the chat over here. But what's been wild about like the stealth mode of Mozilla Data Collective has been there are too many data sets coming our way. There are too many people who are coming at us saying like, oh my God, this is what we've wanted for a really long time. We're really eager, and we're eager to compensate people fairly. We're eager to put our own data sets here. And those are the kinds of signals that I think if you listen to community and you build for them, you have a built-in set of early adopters who will give you feedback, who are bought in, who will hold you accountable. And that's an extraordinary way to have mission lock-in from the beginning and a great use of philanthropic risk capital.
Yeah.
So interesting.
And I'll add to that, Anastasia, because I think, what Nabiha is talking about Mozilla Data Collective is just, we often think of Mozilla as Firefox, but the foundation literally built and shipped and is spinning out a new product this year, and through to next year. So this is an exact really good example of that entire flywheel in action, and how we think, ideate, build, spin out into the ecosystem. The other things that at different levels of where I would say, in the category formation process that we can point to is our next in our next incubator cohort, we're looking at AI and democracy. And I think there, if you had to reduce it down, a lot of that is actually about technical solutions to complex decision making and pluralist environments, right? A lot of that democracy tech is really focused on essentially that. I'm seeing a lot of signals in that space. I was chatting to a couple of folk who actually use democracy tech as forms of organizational decision making in small organizations where, they have different equity structures, different incentive mechanisms, different participation mechanisms. So that's an interesting space to keep an eye on, and we're definitely funding in that space. Some of the other signals is we've, through our grantees, have made awards and allocations to open source quantum, both on the hardware side and also on the software benchmarking side. We're very interested in that space, not from the traditional kind of cryptography and breaking cryptography point of view, but actually how you build kind of communities in the open source space. And then a lot of the energy that's bubbling up, as mentioned, is coming through creative communities as well. There's a real hunger for new tools and platforms amongst creatives in general. And Mozilla Data Collective solves some part of that in terms of here's my artwork or here's my data. I can put it up safely and not worry about it being scraped. But from every community that I've chatted to in the creative space, they're all like, we hate the tools that we're being forced to use. We need new ones, right? And so there's a lot of interesting things coming out of there. And then just most recently, still digesting, but we had our prototyping residency showcase in the Bay Area. I think Nabiha has just put the next one in with Rhizome on the East Coast. And some of those projects are really speaking to very interesting directions. So memory tech with AI. It was pretty AI focused because of the work with Hollywood, but memory tech as an area to keep an eye on. Using AI to preserve heritage and memory, extending memory into new places across different communities, having central banks of memories, having decentralized forms of memory. There was a lot of like energy in that space. Some of the other things, and I'll just mention one or two. The one that I found so interesting was there was an installation that was powered by microbial interactions that was tied up to an AI visual interface. And to me, that's the kind of haute couture version of the idea, right? What is the category formation? Well, it is computational biology. It is actually using forms of bioprocess to find alternatives for the hungry hippo data, the energy consumption for AI. So seeing also the melding between bioprocesses and a lot of the work in biochemical, biocomputing as it relates to AI and computing more generally. Those are very interesting spaces to keep an eye on as well.
And are you seeing that there's like a sequencing from you guys doing this research and prototyping work to it becoming something productized and offered to the market that people can buy and founders can make money on?
Yeah, so the flywheel for Mozilla Data Collective is a great example, right? Like that is not a nonprofit that we're incubating. That's a for-profit company that we're spinning out. But the joy of being a philanthropy that deploys this kind of capital is that we are agnostic to the formation of what this can be. So you can be in our incubator and you could decide that you want to be a volunteer-led library or code library. You could decide to be a nonprofit. You could be a public benefit corporation. You could be whatever it is, whatever structure you want. It was important to us that the first thing that we spun out as a big bet was for-profit, just to remind people that having mission lock in a for-profit is not only possible, it is extremely important to have. And we're obviously not the only ones doing that. There's so many investors like ex-ante that are doing it, but it was important.
Is mission lock like fidelity to the mission, irrespective of like economic signals and price pressure? Okay.
And that mission lock can both be like forged in the early days of a company's formation, as well as baked into the bylaws, which is baked in some ways if you're incorporated in the US. That's going to be incorporated in Denmark, which has like very different obligations. There's a lot of ways to play with mission lock and with corporate structure to ensure those principles are really baked in. And of course, Mozilla itself is like a very particular example of that, where we intentionally own the corporation that makes Firefox in order to have a through line of governance around mission and corporate decision making. And so, but it's important for us to say, like, this is both for profit or it could be any of these other structures, and the incubator has room for all of it.
When we were prepping for the session and just talking about what you guys are focused on, you mentioned that one of the ways you went about figuring out what to do as ED is just like, let's go back to our DNA, which looks something like, why don't we just build the thing that we want to have in the world? So like, never mind the research and the academic angle. It's like, you have an instinct for something that should exist, and then you can rapid prototype it into existence. Is that sort of the way it works day to day, or the operating assumption?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think we would like to be a little bit more community-led and consultative in that. And so that's part of the work and the flywheel that Ziyaad's laying out, like doing this community consultation, surfacing those insights, figuring out how to prototype them, figuring out what seeds from those prototypes can be either planted in our home, like in the incubator and grown, or ultimately shown to others in the philanthropy community. Because one of the things that Mozilla Foundation has been doing for years is that we co-fund with a lot of other philanthropies. And I'm going to just take this opportunity to talk about Humanity AI. We announced earlier this year with Omidyar Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, Lumina Foundation, Mellon Foundation, Gates, GitLab, and I'm going to leave someone out. It's like naming dwarves, but a lot of foundations. A $500 million fund committed to the pro-social, pro-human development of AI technology. And it is both a pooled and aligned fund, which means that aligned funding is every one of those foundations is making grants where they think it's interesting and it's aligned with the principles of Humanity AI. And also a pooled fund where we're coming together to make decisions. And what's great about having these kinds of philanthropy communities is that it positions you to say, well, like, listen, this particular seed isn't ripe for planting in the incubator, but let me show you why I think they're valuable. You should fund them. Or maybe we actually pool and make a bigger bet on one because we see a market opportunity to really be a very active accelerant. And there is something really incredible about having philanthropies collaborate in this way, in a really structured way, around particular theses that are developing. Now for Humanity AI, we're like still fleshing out a lot of that thesis, and you'll see a lot more about it in next year, especially as we start to deploy capital from it in 2026. But it's just it's a way of saying that, like, we want to surface these signals. We also know we're one part of an ecosystem. And I think being a really smart ecosystem player is the only way that we're going to move with the agility, nimbleness, force, and power that hyperscalers can enjoy in a particular institution. We're going to have to move in a decentralized way. And for Mozilla, as an open source org, that's very comfortable.
And how do you make sure that people, like, I guess, new ideas get funded? It feels like philanthropy usually rotates around the same kind of set of target ideas and principles and founders, and it doesn't really play in new spaces as much. I can reliably find, grants for like democracy tech, for example, or privacy. But what about new ideas? How do you surface?
That's what is so magical about this sort of infrastructure that we've been building up, where we're able to say and legitimize new concepts by saying, like, hi, this isn't like a random thing that I like Googled and found. These are ideas that surfaced from groups of people that we brought together, that we have tested out in these ways, that we've helped cross-cutting communities see of one another. And what that does is it both legitimizes the idea, and then by rooting it in community, which of course is extremely appealing to philanthropy that's oriented in pro-social, pro-human ways of building, like in some ways intellectually de-risks it and really brings it into the fold in quite a unique way. And so by the time we've sort of run through our process, which by the way is not lengthy, right? Like this isn't like years and years and years of doing this, like a pretty nimble sprint to like bring people together in these sort of structured ways, derive insights, present the insights in a digestible, comprehensible way. We've taken off a lot of that work, a lot of that fear that lets philanthropies often regress to sort of the known players. And so that's our attempt of de-risking.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's an important note to emphasize that philanthropy can be very conservative. And so when we use the phrase, and Neil actually asked this in the chat, when we talk about philanthropic risk capital, it's doing two things at once. It's both saying that philanthropy offers a number of different pathways to resource exchange and contribution. It's not just cash, it's time, it's expertise, it's networks, all the similar things that we find in like venture world as well. So when we talk about risk capital, we're actually talking about, funding and support and actual injection. But then secondly, that philanthropy can tend, as you rightly point out, Anastasia, can tend towards a conservatism around a set group of players. Fields gets built. That's explicitly what, to go back to your original question about what we were unlearning, right? What Nabiha's leadership has actually very much unlocked in Mozilla Foundation, which is We shouldn't tread these paths. We should be very experimental. We should take the term philanthropic risk capital very seriously because we are at the stage where we can take risks more so than venture capitalists, and we should be taking those.
Mhm. So great. Is there anything from the Unlearning Fest or the Mozilla Fest specifically that emerged as, a new idea or a light bulb moment of like, oh, this is what we've been missing in our operating plan?
Oh, I don't know about the operating plan, but I will say one thing that was a surprise. For quite some time, MozFest was like a big raucous open tent, like hackathons and this kind of event. And then it became much smaller, in part because of COVID, in part because that was just like a design decision to be like smaller groups of like researchers and academics coming together. And so this last one was like an experiment both in its operation. We were like, let's make it big again, like big tent all over again, invite in very different people who don't always agree, often agree, ever agree, to be in the same room to really discuss things, and to debate even. And, we weren't sure how that was going to go operationally. And then we weren't sure how the theme would land, because to unlearn something, especially with people that you might disagree with or have a different background from, like requires a vulnerability. Vulnerability is not what I would associate with like tech-oriented conferences, right? Like it's usually like human LinkedIn is what's happening at these conferences. And so I wasn't sure if it was going to work. And so the area of surprise for me, and I think that this is a reflection of the zeitgeist, is that people were immediately using the language of unlearning. People were talking openly on stages about here's what I know, here's what I don't know, here's what I'm nervous about, here's where I think the potentials of quantum computing could be. Hi, I don't even know what quantum computing is. Like people were showing up with curiosity and vulnerability. And I think that that's because there's both excitement and trepidation about what the future is about to bring. And I think that feeling of urgency can be alchemized into like, okay, well, we have to do something, but we don't know what. And we're being told that everything's changing. So let's just like open ourselves up and try to figure it out together. And that was just surprising to see in a, over 2,000 people festival with 79 different countries represented. Like it was just wild to see that across cultures, across age groups, across everything. And so, I think there's a lot that we're continuing to follow up on with the communities of people that came together, with the people who did follow-on funding for first incubator cohort, for new ideas that were sort of demoed, because we had a whole demo area where people were demonstrating like their startups and other things they're working on. So I think we're still collecting all those learnings, but I was just surprised by the openness that people had to have these conversations. So you had any pieces that you saw? I was like running around from stage to stage too. What did you see?
The thing that I took away most was what you just mentioned, like the geographic diversity of things and how different people from different regions are thinking about tech, are talking about different markets, non-markets, etc. How it all kind of coalesced in one different place. And the broad learning that I took away from that, and I do want to emphasize here because it can be the case that we think that innovation just means we're constantly scanning the horizon for whatever the next big thing is. But it's also how do different regions absorb the familiar categories as well, right? And so that was also present in Mozilla Festival. It was like, okay, we're talking about democracy and AI. We've been talking about this in the US context. There's so many spaces for startups that are interested or community groups that are interested in this technology and are doing things interestingly in the space already that we could support. So there's a kind of a regional innovation strategy as well that we're actually acutely set up to support because we are global. But that came out quite strongly because of that convergence at Mozilla Festival.
Were there any product categories that are not sort of native to the US investor or founder that people should notice? What I'm thinking is like mobile money that emerged out of East Africa. It's huge and they were way ahead. I think it's like a really bright example of a massive, massive, massive market that just didn't happen in Silicon Valley. Are there other examples? Just more humble pie for everybody. Where else should we be looking?
I don't have an answer steady at hand, but I will say like scouting for our M-Pesa, right? Of like, because I love this, like M-Pesa predated Apple Pay by 9 years.
So insane. The M-Pesa is the Kenyan startup. Well, it's not a startup anymore, it's an institution, but that's the origin of mobile money is M-Pesa
Yeah,
for
and
the audience.
it was because this was like a real need that people had, that when you're solving for convenience, which is often what you're solving for in
Hmm.
the Western context, not exclusively, but often, especially
Hmm.
with consumer-facing technologies, it's like around convenience. There's a totally different innovation logic when you're solving for like different pain points. And that piece of like the global South element and welcoming into our incubator, building on this global footprint that Mozilla's enjoyed for the last 25 years is like where I think the biggest opportunity is. We just launched our incubator at MozFest in November. So this is all new, but I will say like finding those categories, surfacing those categories, not just individual firms or projects that were like, hey guys, this is interesting, but those entire categories, like that's the
Hmm.
reason for setting up this infrastructure over the last year.
Yeah, Ziad, anything on that? Because I'll follow up already.
Yeah, there was some interesting because obviously, fintech is like one of the big hot areas right now,
Yeah.
right? There was some interesting stuff, and I'm again connecting it to the democracy work.
Mhm.
There's a firm called Decidim that we partnered
Yeah.
with, and they had a festival the week before, and they do a lot of participatory budgeting, and that's such an interesting space. How do you actually get communities to have agency over kind of financial decisions, budgeting decisions? I thought that it was like a technology and a product space that's like decentralized, that they've shipped into different regions as well. I thought that was super
Did
smart.
that come out of microfinance and micro grants?
No, but actually, I don't know how they started. It's a good question for me to probe and follow up. They're great. I don't know how they started, to be honest. But I know that they've kind of locked themselves in Spain and in Barcelona in particular as a regional, as a hub generally through the kind of startup community as well, tech startup in that region. They also bumped into some folk who are working on like tech solutions for executive search and workforce in sub-Saharan Africa, folk who are working on new approaches to compute and access to compute and markets for compute in sub-Saharan Africa as
Mhm.
well. So there was a number of different areas that I think might be tracked on the more development side as well for product areas to kind of equalize some of the access constraints that we have. That's what we see a lot of actually, I would say, is that the moment you shift things out of kind of the North America transatlantic orbit, you start to talk about like scrappiness. Start to talk about resource,
Mm.
right?
Scrappiness. That's a category. Scrappy
And that
technology. What does that look like?
totally. Nabiha, I'm
Low
going to pass it to you.
compute, high performance.
In Hindi, it's called jugad. So there's this
Yeah.
entire phrase in Indian innovation, which is like when people are in conditions that require you to be frugal and flexible, um, to do more with less, you're like, I can't just go buy another tire. I'm gonna need to have to make one out of whatever available materials. Like jugad is like the heartbeat of a particular type of innovation. And I think that is like such a juicy thing to tap into, that like from need and necessity comes innovation is not a novel concept, but one that perhaps we should re-embrace.
I
And
am here for Jugaad as a service.
right, and one that subverts the sort of logic that's ever present now of like you just need to have $1 bajillion to do it.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting, which is like just deflating at its outset, where you're like, well, I don't have $1 billion, so I guess I'll go back to scrolling on TikTok. And Decidim, which Ziad mentioned, is actually a great example of this. So its history is I think it was 2015, 2016, there was an anti-austerity movement in Spain, and a lot of people saying like, you're deciding to cut back on government services, on government benefits, and like, but you're still spending money on this other stuff. Like, what's going on here? Sound familiar, Americans? And so they decided that there was a group of people who came together to basically fork, I think it's called consult or console software, and say, like, hey, what if we did participatory budgeting so we could actually have buy-in, visibility, and understanding of how money is being used? And it
Mhm.
started in Barcelona. Decidir means let's decide or let's discuss or something like that. And it's really interesting, right? Just in these moments of dissent and disagreement and unhappiness with how decisions are being made, to look to participatory approaches to say we can actually gather consent in a totally different way. It's really, I find it very heartening. In this era of Mozilla, we refer to the spirit of like defiant optimism as a really important animating principle. You got to be a little defiant, like ready to like break some eggs, but ultimately optimistic and hopeful about what the future will bring. And I think of like Decidim and these other examples born out of necessity, born out of Jagad, as like the ultimate in defiant optimism, which is like we're not going to accept what's being given to us. We don't have to. And I think that's actually the real story of technology is that's what founders do, right? We're like, I see opportunity here and I reject everything that's being given to me already. And that's why it just felt right to remake the organization in that spirit or reactivate that spirit.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting category, just making things that exist more efficient and operational under tighter constraints. It's really why you never want to overfund a company that's new and then just watch them like spend profligately before they've made critical decisions about very important architectures. And it's just like a really smart way to look for new products. Like, what are you doing that is already assumed to be some sort of like default or just unquestioned assumption? How are you questioning that assumption and making it, faster, cheaper, better, more accessible? I love it.
Yeah, it's just one point on that. I mean, it's also worthwhile that particularly in the
Yeah.
AI development context to realize there are going to be real constraints like compute, for example,
Yeah.
right? There are real constraints that are there, but that's where the Mozilla sort of brand and the relationships that we've had over the years is particularly useful because we work with a lot of governments to be like, hi, do you care about sovereign AI? Do you care about open source AI approaches? You should consider resourcing your ecosystem accordingly. And so that's led to conversations with governments around the world who are very actively considering, and we will see what comes to fruition over the next year. But I'm very optimistic, like really innovative approaches to say, okay, if these are the structural prerequisites for this kind of innovation to happen, let us provide that credit. And that's a really great way of sort of shaping the sense of possibility with governments as partners, not to like say this is where your investment should go if you actually want a pro innovation and a pro competition ecosystem. And so we're really trying to approach this work as like, we can build what we're going to build in the foundation, understanding the ecosystem of philanthropic capital. But there's also a broader opportunity here of unlocking government capital, government partnerships in a not to capture, but to enable and embolden other kinds of innovation. And I think we have a really important responsibility to be doing that.
Has any of your discovery work, especially outside of the North Atlantic mindset, focused on privacy? Is there a demand for privacy? I think my theory is like if you're in a high conflict zone or in a zone where you have fewer democratic guarantees, you're more interested in privacy preserving options. But has that been true in your work at all?
Yeah, it's privacy is one of our sort of like bread and butter issues, has been for a very long time, for quite a while, was like a differentiating component.
Yeah.
Firefox. And I think the most useful recurrent signal we have of that is in addition to having capital sourced from the profits of the corporation and from philanthropic partners that we raise from, we also raise grassroots funding, deploy into other things. And the grassroots funding is really, really important because it keeps a accountability signal to the broader public that we can, it's like you can see if you talk about a particular issue, whether people are willing to donate to you or not. You can also see that if people are mad at you, they will tell you. And so we have over 88,000, just over, donors from around the world from 122 countries. 32,000 of those are new from this year. So this sort of pro-building perspective is resonating broadly. And without fail, when we talk about privacy or encryption, we get very positive feedback signals from our group, which is, again, represents 122 different countries. And so there's obviously spaces that have more of a cultural affinity to talking about the importance of privacy. And you see that in our German contingent, our Swiss contingent, our European friends, but it is actually broadly around the world, just metabolized in slightly different ways, right? Some, it's like metabolized as like, this is a dignitary right. This is something that we need. This is something, a principled approach. And then others are like quite practical. Like I'm under the watch of a regime or taking dissent positions against a government. And I like need to know that people are fighting for a way to give me the ability to have that freedom.
I think it's also just a strange category because it's both something people don't value and constantly argue that they most need, and it's a blocker for adoption. Like I'm constantly seeing that people vote with their dollars away from privacy in favor of convenience. Like they just won't pay for it. It's just not something people pay for. But then you look at research and then privacy and things like ethical guarantees are like the top stated reasons that people won't use a product or want to ship from a product or aren't adopting AI. what's with the limbo? Do people care about it? Does it matter like who the people are? Is it actually a consumer fallacy to say that people want privacy? What are you finding?
I think it's hard to talk about at a high level of abstraction and then starts to
Yeah.
be really coherent with particular communities, right? And so you can see like in the dramatic uptick of signal usage amongst communities of color in the United States, like the risk model, like the threat model there is very clear. It's like, I do not want to be arrested by ICE for things that I'm saying on social media. So I'm going to say them on my signal channel instead. And so you start to see these communities of people who have really clearly articulated threat models that involve or require privacy. And then all of a sudden the logic is clear. I think what we do see is for people who sort of fall into the like, well, I have nothing to hide, right? Like we've all heard that a billion times. I have nothing to hide and it's all done anyway and whatever. That sort of that category of mindset. Yeah, you see sort of private, so fatalism there. But I think when you, at least some of the research I've seen, when you start to distill like into more specific different communities, just it has a different logic. There's also, we have been experimenting with the language of data agency. People with privacy is dead. And you're like, yeah, but do you think that you have agency over your own data? Should you have control? Well, of course I should have control.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's going to be our entry point then. We're going to go in that way. And so I think this is an area actually for unlearning and experimentation of like, what is the more nuanced language we use to talk about these concepts that might seem tired in one frame, but deeply relevant in another.
Yeah, I mean, I started out as a privacy expert, academic type person, and not only did people not care about it, but I didn't care about it because I'm like, I'm not here for privacy. Like, I am not a privacy absolutist. I did not, I was not born with the purpose of becoming private. Like, what's the thing that is hiding underneath privacy? Like, what am I trying to get to? And I'm realizing, and I have realized actually, this is why this podcast used to be called the privacy podcast, but is now the agentic tech podcast, because privacy is like a stepping stone to and an enabler of something. What is that something? Oh, it's agency. That's what the whole genesis of this like agentic tech thing was like, it's one of the things we need, one of the primitives we need to be true in the technological and policy landscape for me to enjoy having autonomy and agency and sovereignty as a human being. And so it lands much better. And so when I talk to people about privacy, I also use the data metaphor. I'll sometimes say like data is your digital body. Like, do you know who's touching it? Maybe Nabiha or Ziyaad, is there any visibility or interest in right now the crypto space or cryptography, novel cryptographic techniques?
Yeah, I mean, I think so many in that community are people who share the Mozilla Manifesto principles deeply. It's a community that I think in the earlier phases of the foundation didn't really see like the moments of the intersection points. I think now we are, as we move with the spirit of like, listen, like these are big, meaty issues. We want to break bread and engage with people who we might have one intersection point and every other point is not in fact an intersection point, but there's still something we can learn from one another. I think that it's a community that it would just be an unforced error for us to not engage with more. And we're trying to figure out kind of what that space is. I would love ideation and community pitches on what other interesting cohorts would be for our incubator, because we do pick different topics, bring people together, try to find those overlaps and those different approaches, opportunities for unlearning, opportunities for collaboration. And it's always fun to hear what's on people's minds. So for this community in particular, like pitch your cohorts. Like it would be really interesting to see what people surface as topical.
Yeah, I think the ZK identity and digital identity space in general is really interesting as a cross intersection with democracy tech and conflict zones, and remains this unsolved question that I think entered the public consciousness, if you're sufficiently nerdy, during COVID and kind of fizzled out, but it's still an unsolved issue.
Yeah, it's a great topic.
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And this kind of brings us a little bit full circle here.
Perfect.
We've been talking about like interest in privacy and encryption and things like that. And Nabiha, we started this conversation talking about Snowden. And I'm curious whether or not any of you, I guess, believe that we need some sort of like Snowden moment in the context of privacy and AI to really get meaningful movement from big players in the space. Because I think what I feel like I hear over and over again is that people are very interested in privacy
Mhm.
on a principled level, but for the most part, we're still not seeing enterprises or consumers like meaningfully paying for it. So I've been wondering, like, is there a catalyst? Like, does there need to be like a major leak or breach, or does there need to be some other like catalyzing event that creates a meaningful shift?
Yeah, this is a great provocation. I'm really interested in what everyone else has to say. Here's what I will say. I think the incident is not enough. So yes, I think we need an incident, but I think we need this storytelling and the sense making that comes from the incident as well as and then what? Right? Because there are huge breaches that have happen every day. Every time I open my mail, they're like, remember that one time you went to the doctor? Well, guess what? The whole world knows everything about that now. There was a breach. And it's because there isn't like that sort of moment of breakthrough that happens. And so full circle in this conversation, for Snowden, the moment of breakthrough happened because we were able to tell a story in a unified way that got everyone's attention. I think for a moment like this, like a breakthrough moment to actually happen, it's going to require way more intentional storytelling and alternative. Like, hi, this terrible thing happened with consequences. And here's what you can do about it. Because I think that's actually the only way to combat the cynicism that has festered since Snowden. And so it's going to be incident plus storytelling plus alternative. And what I love about the community that you've brought together is that these are people who are like ready with alternatives and ready with other approaches. And that's going to be kind of the moment to shine.
I was just curious to get your thoughts on. One is just generally vibe coding and the democratization of software development and how that might lead to more co-design in smaller community. And then relatedly, kind of open social web tech that might similarly like enable more trusted human curation mechanisms versus kind of these bigger algorithmic plays.
They're both areas that were like very live and hot topics at MozFest, like very much so. There was an entire vibe coding boot camp, and not vibe coding as a like, and now you're a software developer, but vibe coding as entry point into non-market technology building. Like there's a great guy called Josh Nesbitt who builds relational tech, like these like interfaces for you to just organize and connect your neighborhood or your building. There's no commercial value to this app whatsoever. It's just a way for people to see each other and like bridge the kind of loneliness and community gap that we see too often in modern life. And so I think I'm really bullish on vibe coding, not because it will spawn a generation of new software engineers, because it's a lot more than coding. It's like a whole mentality instead of problem solving, but as an entry point into understanding what the technology can do and what's possible for non-market applications, incredible. Oh my God, on social, so much. But I think that this is like a very rich vein because for many, many people, their first pain points of modern technology, of modern internet are because like their social sucks. And so people feel the pain point and they're like, wait, I want something better. And it's like, great, there's a lot of people doing that. Come on in.
Perfect. Thank you so much for really just lively back and forth. Really enjoyed talking to you both. Hope you liked it too.
It was great. We
Yeah.
love this community and the questions were amazing. So thanks for having us on.
Awesome. Well, happy holidays, everybody.